Good. About a month ago, the Washington Post ran a front page story that suggested that free public Wi-Fi was being put together by the Federal Communications Commission. They were trying to build a network that would give everyone everywhere affordable access to wireless internet services. It's a story that caused waves both inside and outside of Washington. The reaction from DC insiders and policy wonks was one of dismay. They looked at this story and they said the FCC is doing nothing of the sort. It is working on ways that we can reallocate spectrum for wireless internet use, but didn't have planned to build its own free public Wi-Fi system. And even among the sort of more libertarian crowd inside DC, and it was an opportunity for them to raise their most feared specter, the specter of government control of the internet. Now, outside of DC, the reaction was remarkably different. It rocketed to the front page of Reddit and Dig, and it was picked up by NPR, which provoked my mother, who's 77 years old, to pick up her phone and call her son to talk about communications policy. That's the first time that happened in more of a decade of my doing this sort of work. The disconnect between Washington insiders and the rest of us was readily apparent in this story. And it's telling. And in many ways, it underscores many of the discussions that we're having here at Freedom to Connect. I would suggest that these opposing views are a reaction to a problem that we have in DC. It's a problem that we call the influence industry. The influence industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It employs thousands of lobbyists, lawyers, PR flacks, researchers, consultants. It generates reams of reports, fake research, from what we call coin-operated think tanks. It fuels, it's spawned legions of super PACs with unusual names like the Committee for Truth in Politics and Americans for Prosperity. It's the money that's behind industry front groups like Broadband for America. The influence industry fertilizes the astroturf. The primary aims of the influence industry are to establish or dictate conventional wisdom inside Washington, D.C., and to elect certain politicians who are adherents, who will adhere to this conventional wisdom. It also puts in place policies that will protect the interests of very powerful corporations. We're going to take some time to look at this, but it should be known that the influence industry is very effective, but it's also very corrupt. And I suppose if you look at the program, you see that this portion of the program is called Money, Corruption, and Politics. And we're going to talk a little bit about the way the influence industry corrupts telecommunications policy, and more specifically, how it corrupts efforts by groups, some of whom you've heard from, to create local broadband solutions. We have with us today some people who can tell you something about this. Now I'm going to ask them to only speak for 5 minutes, so that we can get to questions from you. And I'm going to ask you to think about your questions, to think what you might want to hear from this panel, what you might expect from us, and get ready to ask them. I hope we have an hour. I hope that we'll have plenty of time at the end to get into a thorough discussion here. But we're gonna start with Catharine Rice, and Catharine has worked on this issue from a very local perspective in the Southeast, in North Carolina. I think she's now involved in Georgia as well, and other parts of the region. Catharine, do you want to go next?
Is this working? Hi, and I have to give a plug. I am the president of SEATOA, which is an association of local community broadband planners and local video producers. But I'm also on the board of NATOA, which is our national organization who works every day to fight the good fight on behalf of our communities. I'm pleased to have 5 minutes because when we got to speak in front of the Senate, when we were fighting the broadband bill in North Carolina, we were given 2 minutes. So I had to talk really fast, and because your name takes 15 seconds already. I'm just going to give a little bit of background because we really want to generate questions. But the background in North Carolina, I think you all might have remembered from last year. It kind of started because there was a community in eastern North Carolina that had as its economic base tobacco, textile, and manufacturing. And over the course of the last 30 years, they had a taste of globalization before a lot of us have, and they watched their economy go overseas to Asia and Mexico. And as good local officials, they looked at the issue and looked for solutions on how to protect their economy, how to create jobs, and improve the quality of life for their residents and their businesses. And their conclusion was they needed to build next-generation roads, next-gen roads, which, of course, meant using fiber optics. So the first thing they did is they communicated to their incumbent provider who was serving their community, Time Warner Cable. They asked them to partner. And Time Warner Cable's general manager literally laughed in the face of the town manager, said, "We're Time Warner Cable, why would we ever partner with Wilson?" And walked away. So Wilson started building, and they built themselves a fiber-to-the-home network. Time Warner Cable found out about it, and they went walking to Raleigh. And for the next 4 years, they were able to get legislators to introduce legislation to try to stop municipalities from building their own broadband systems, even where there was no broadband. We fought that battle for 4 years. We beat it back 4 years. And then there was a huge change in the control of the House and the Senate. In North Carolina, it went from 100-year control by the Democrats to control by the Republicans. And in 2011, Time Warner Cable's bill went ripping through with great speed and became law within about 2 months in May 2011. That bill was then taken by AT&T down to Georgia the same year, and Georgia beat that bill. We couldn't touch it in North Carolina. They beat it. And the way they beat it was they went to their municipal co-ops and said, talk to your clients, who were businesses. And those businesses called their legislators. And their legislators heard that this was also bad for the private sector as much as it's bad for everybody else. That bill has now come back again. And probably Jim Baller will talk a little bit more about this, but it's pretty scary. It's gotten through a subcommittee and a full committee, and I think it'll go to the House floor either today or tomorrow. They're defining an unserved area as anyone who can't get 3 megabit down, but with no definition of upload speed. So as you know, if you try to upload and you're being given 768K, you're not going to upload. So, but they'll be considered served in Georgia. The link to our next speaker probably is that in North Carolina, the bill's sponsor that became law, on her own biography, described herself, her past life, as a finance manager for the John Locke Foundation. The John Locke Foundation is 80% funded by a fellow named Art Pope, who is actually very good friends with the Koch brothers, Americans for Prosperity, Heartland Institute. He funds all those, and he was a critical player in turning over control of our legislature to the Republicans. So the bill that first came out was an ALEC bill, and the link is made.
Next we have, you may have seen Lisa Graves' name on the program. Lisa is busy with some work in Washington, D.C. related to these issues, but she has asked Brendan Fischer to fill in for her. Brendan is their legal counsel at the Center for Media and Democracy, and any of you who have been following the campaign against ALEC in the last year or two is very familiar with the Center's work. Brendan's going to talk a little bit about the telecommunications piece of that. The ALEC legislation covers a gamut of issues, and in 2012 there was a focus on voter disenfranchisement issues that were being pushed at the state level. But we haven't heard a lot about the telecommunications piece, so we're happy to have Brendan here to tell us more.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So basically what ALEC is, for those who aren't familiar, is it's a vehicle for business and right-wing interests to advance their agenda through the states and exert influence over law and policy but largely without the public really knowing. So it's at closed-door ALEC meetings where corporations like AT&T or right-wing think tanks like the Heartland Institute are basically handing legislators changes to our laws that either advance some sort of ideological interest or benefit the corporate bottom line. ALEC is 98% funded by its private sector members. Legislators pay $50 per year to join, but the corporations and think tanks that are ALEC members pay up to $25,000 a year for membership, plus additional thousands to join ALEC task forces, additional fees to sponsor ALEC meetings, and I think, as Edwin will tell you, you can follow the money to determine who's really going to be calling the shots in a situation like this. So the bills, ALEC bills, have been secret for most of its nearly 40-year existence. It was in 2011 when a whistleblower came to us with nearly 800 of these model bills, previously secret model bills, and we published the website alecexposed.org that we could begin to put the pieces together and track the special interest influence over law and policy for the past decades. So the attacks on unions in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin can be traced to ALEC. The voter suppression legislation that swept the country after the 2010 elections also traced to ALEC. And the Stand Your Ground law that in Florida was initially cited to shield Trayvon Martin's killer from prosecution also spread across the country thanks to ALEC. And ALEC has also been one of the key avenues by which AT&T and Verizon and Time Warner have pushed their agenda. So the ALEC bill that's probably been most successful is the Municipal Broadband Preemption Bill that was just discussed. That was actually adopted in 2004. Various iterations of the bill have passed in 19 states since then. ALEC's also attacked municipal cable franchises to free cable companies from oversight with bills such as the Cable and Video Competition Act, also bills that deregulate the phone industry with names like Broadband and Telecommunications Deployment Act, the Advanced Voice Services Availability Act. In Wisconsin, where CMD is located, each of those four bills that I mentioned were passed in the mid-2000s and sponsored by a representative named Phil Montgomery. Montgomery was ALEC's Legislator of the Year in 2007, and he led the ALEC Telecommunications Task Force. And when Governor Scott Walker, who himself was an ALEC alum, was elected in 2010, he appointed Montgomery, this ALEC award winner, this ALEC leader, to lead Wisconsin Public Services Commission, which deals with a lot of these same issues. So in the past year, 43 major corporations have dropped their ALEC membership, largely in response to this really amazing campaign led by the online civil rights group Color of Change, as well as the organization I work for, the Center for Media and Democracy, Common Cause, Progress Now, and others. So basically, companies like Coca-Cola and Walmart and Amazon have recognized that they don't want their brands associated with an organization that pushes stand your ground laws and voter suppression and climate change denial. But interestingly, despite this exodus of corporate membership, the telecom companies have remained involved. A AT&T representative is still on the ALEC board. Time Warner still sponsors ALEC meetings. So I think that this is proof that ALEC remains very vital to these organizations. So the question might be, why should you care? Because I think it's clear that this fight for broadband access and fair telecommunications policy is about more than ALEC, that these companies are going to be continuing to push their agenda regardless of whether ALEC exists. But the problem is that ALEC really allows them to push their agenda in a pernicious and very secretive way. So the biggest problem is the way that ALEC allows the industry to exert this excessive influence. These meetings where the bills are adopted are closed to the press and public. There's no consumer advocates present at these meetings. And ALEC and member legislators have taken great pains to shield their communications from open records laws. In Wisconsin, we had to sue to get access to these public records when legislators tried evading their FOIA responsibilities by shifting their correspondence to personal email accounts. What this basically means is that in these ALEC meetings, the only voice being heard is that of industry. And as I mentioned before, ALEC receives 98% of its funding from the private sector, so it's clear who's calling the shots. And these ALEC meetings last for 3 days, so when you're lobbying in the State House, you have a lobbyist has about 15 to 20 minutes with a legislator. At ALEC meetings, they've got their ear for 3 days, and then they sit them down for workshops. After hours, they take them out to parties. So in some ways, it's really the legislators who start to become the lobbyists for the corporate agenda through ALEC. They come back to their state house convinced that a particular policy, which in many cases complicated, is a good idea. They're the ones armed with the talking points, the industry-funded talking points. They're selling their fellow legislators and the general public on these policies. It actually gets worse. So for legislators, the deal is sweetened by ALEC's private sector members paying for all of the legislators' flights and hotel rooms to these ALEC meetings, which kind of resemble a vacation. They're held in fun places, they're held at fancy hotels. Legislators make about $40,000 a year, so for many of them, these types of trips would be out of bounds. It would be unaffordable. On top of that, the legislators are encouraged to bring their family, to bring their children. Time Warner Cable paid for childcare for all of the legislators for this 3-day meeting at the 2011 ALEC meeting in New Orleans, which I think in past years it cost up to $300,000. So basically, this is a lot of fun for the legislators, but it creates this environment for improper influence. And almost every state has ethics and lobbying laws that would prohibit this type of improper influence, would prohibit legislators from accepting these types of expensive gifts. But ALEC has gotten around it by calling these gifts a scholarship. Instead of having the corporations hand the funds directly to legislators, hand the plane tickets and hotel rooms directly to legislators, they filter it through what they call a scholarship fund. And the company that gave the second most to the scholarship fund over a 3-year period was AT&T. They spent more than $100,000 over a 3-year period paying for these flights and hotel rooms for legislators to attend these ALEC meetings, where they can be lobbied, where they can be handed talking points. And on top of all of this, ALEC is a 501c3 charity, which means that the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars that the telecom industry and other corporations are paying to access these legislators is a tax write-off. It's a charitable tax write-off. So I think ALEC is very possibly violating its charitable status, but all of this really adds up to a situation with improper influence, excessive special interest influence, and I don't think we should stand for it. But I can take more questions after this.
Edwin. We've had Edwin Bender, who is the executive director of the National Institute of Money in State Politics. Edwin has spent a lot of time in this role. In particular, he's done a lot of research about the way money is tracked through state governments, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the way corporations use their money at the state level.
If I can get this to come up. Oh, there you go. That's a low tech. As that's booting up. So, yeah, I'm Ed Bender. I'm with the National Institute on Money and State Politics. Now, the intersection, ALEC, broadband legislation, obviously comes down to what happens in state houses, happens at the federal level, happens at state houses, and it happens lower down. What we do at the Institute is try to fill a void of information about who is participating in your state-level elections and how that translates, works down the system to how they get access to particular points where decisions are made. Are we up? Up. So to do this, just very quickly background, we go to each of the disclosure agencies in all 50 states and we pull out the data. So there's an FEC that does the presidential and congressional information. We go to each state disclosure agency and pull this data down, electronic, PDFs, some of it we even key in. We end up building from over 100,000 reports filed by 16,000 candidates, a database of over 3 million records. That data runs through processes. We're good friends with the Center for Responsive Politics, which does this work at the federal level. We've made our codes parallel, so you know if you hit all the bankers at the federal level at CRP's Open Secrets website, you can see bankers at our website, and they'll be the same players. So we're working aggressively to try to make sure that the data for all of this that allows you to look deeper into why something's happening is high quality data. And I can go into the data later, but I don't want to take up my precious few minutes. So what we do after we get all the data into the computer, we obviously go through standardized names. We give it a CAT code, so all the broadband donors would be given a broadband type of a code. And that allows you to look into those millions of records of data and pull out the set that is most important to you. And then we put it in a visual format that we hope begins to help you tell the story. So right off the bat, what this data does, once we have it in the can, we're able to do a real quick search and show. So I just did a filtering mechanism here, and I can show it to you. Let me do the back. So what I did was, after I clicked on that national map, there's a little, says view, filter by contributor's economic interest. I simply went down, expanded that to the point where I got to the telecom services. You can see how many records we have for that, how many millions of dollars, and how much it was of the total. And then I simply hit submit, and that gives you a map then of the country that shows you the broadband, how much has been given by this subset of donors in those states. Click on a state and you automatically go into who those donors are. So I won't go into it too much further, but this shows you that the telecom services folks have given across the country for 2012, $18.5 million. Change the year here and you can see how much they gave in 2010, so on down the road. You can also select out just committees, or if you want to look at ballot measures. We break the data down in a million different ways. So there's more data here than you can probably use, but hopefully this gets you thinking about how to get into the data. Now we know that you're going to be going after certain companies. So I just did a real quick search from any page. You can go up and do AT&T, and this is what you're going to get, is what we call a donor summary page. So you see donors over the broad period, over a decade. AT&T has given over $44 million at the state level. I'll click here in a second. We build list of the state registered lobbyists, and we correlate them with their clients and then the clients' donations. I'll click on that in just a second to show you how the donors, or they're making donations, companies are making donations, but they're also hiring lobbyists that help work the system. But from this simple page, you get an overview of how much AT&T is given its subsidiaries, the Republican Democrat breakdown, third party. One figure that we note a lot is of particular importance: 13,807 incumbents received 86% of the money. When these guys are going in to work on a piece of legislation, implement a legislative strategy, you have to remember this is a business plan. They're implementing a business plan, and they're doing it just like they sell products. They're picked who they give money to, and they pick who's going to be sitting on particular committees. Further down, you get the states and then the lawmakers and how much they've received. You can see our good friend Rick Perry has received a little bit of money. Gray Davis did back too. You can see where they give to the party committees. They give to both sides of the aisle. They're not partisan in any of this. And when push comes to shove, they jump into ballot measures. Click on any of these, and it takes you into deeper data about what's going on, where they're giving their money, and why. Now, I want to show you the lobbyist piece real quickly. We also we're diving into independent expenditures. They're reported very poorly in the states. We have independent expenditures in about 22 states. They play there. So if you click on this lobbyist piece, you'll get a list of where, come on. The states where they've been active. So in Alabama, they hired 27 lobbyists over this particular time period and made contributions of $179,000. Click on these and you'll get down and actually see who the lobbyist is and which years they made, AT&T made contributions. So as you're looking at trying to confront or balance the efforts that their companies are, the strategies they're using. This gives you information to help do that. And lastly, what we've done, since we know that most of the decision-making in any legislative process is not the vote. The vote's kind of the show. Academic research shows that. The power is in the legislative committees. So what we've done is create, using APIs from a group called Project VoteSmart, they do wonderful work. We've created a committee analysis tool. So in this case, I've gone to California. These are 2013 committees. We're still building some of the 2013 committees, and I've selected out the House committees. I've selected arts, entertainment, sports, tourism, and internet media. So here are our committee members, chairman, and who they represent. The amounts of money, I filtered this for electronics and communications, so you can see the totals and how much they got from electronics and communications. But perhaps the most important piece of this is when you see that AT&T gave to 6 members, Time Warner gave to 3, Cable Telecom Association gave to 3, Verizon gave to 3. Now this is not big money. This isn't Congress. It is California, and they're kind of close to Congress, but this is not Congress. And they're buying access here. They're saying, hi, I know you, you know me, now let's talk. And they have those. So from the dedicated ALEC meetings where they're sitting around the table talking, then Time Warner or AT&T walks in and says, or the lobbyist and says, here's checks from my friend. We hope you get elected. Of course, they're incumbents because they are going to get elected. Anyway, I don't want to go on much further. We can talk a lot more about the data. But what we're doing is try to take all this data and do heavy lifting that gives you then access and some entry points to begin to understand that if something's happening in your state legislature, you can look at your lawmaker. There's a place to do that summary for a lawmaker. Look at the companies. Look at just your state for the last election cycle. So when you walk into a committee hearing on this broadband legislation, you can say, oh, well, 4 members have received contributions from AT&T. I need to talk to them because they have already been talked to in 5 different ways by the AT&T and their lobbyist. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Edwin. So I'm going to ask a couple follow-up questions, but if you have some questions that you would like to ask, we do have mics here. David, are these live, the ones in the...
The ones this mic should be live, and that mic is likely to be live too.
So come to the mics. This is being live streamed, so people want to hear you at home. And we'll get to your questions. I have just a follow-up question. First for Catherine. It seems like, this has been going on for quite some time. I don't know what the count is. I'm sure that, Christopher, you could tell us how many states now have passed this anti-immunity type legislation. And it was North Carolina. It's moved to Georgia. There are several states before that. Is there any way that we can really break this cycle of new legislation being introduced in every new session?
Well, that's a big question, and I think we're seeing something really fascinating going on right now. When the North Carolina bill passed and became law, I thought the world was over. Half our state is rural, so. But what we saw in Georgia, which was not to be partisan, but it was Republican governor, Republican Senate and House, is that they stopped the same bill. And how did they do it? Well, they went to the business community. And they made it clear that this was anti-private sector as much as it was anti-public sector. And that's the thing about broadband is that it is economic development. It's our health care and our public safety, but it's also economic development. What we're seeing in North Carolina now is something fascinating, which is where a number of communities, including Raleigh, have come together with their university partners. So we have NC State, and we have Chapel Hill and Carrboro, who've partnered with UNC, and a couple others, to bring resources to the table to see if they can attract another provider or providers to provide a gig. And I say it's fascinating because we have got all the chambers of commerce supporting the idea that you need to bring gig into the community. There needs to be more providers. And we have big businesses that are well known in the Research Triangle Park, like SAS and Red Hat. So one thing I think, 2020 vision is expand into the business community with your message, because this is as much about their ability to reach out and touch as it is about consumers' ability to get. So that was just kind of a sidebar lesson.
Great, thanks. Brendan, with the fight against ALEC, we've seen some impressive victories. Your work, Color of Change's work, is really focused on the voter disenfranchisement legislation, the Stand Your Ground legislation. As I mentioned earlier, there hasn't been as much focus yet on the telecommunications policies that are a part of the ALEC push. What's next for that? Do you see the kind of public pressure campaign that can get an AT&T or a Time Warner Cable to back off of ALEC support in the future?
Sure. And there has been some really good work recently on exposing the ALEC telecom agenda done by Chris Mitchell, who spoke earlier, and Todd O'Boyle from Common Cause. But we've had a campaign focusing on AT&T for a few months now, and we're going to continue doing that. So even though people in this room might not be happy about what AT&T is doing generally, the fact that they're funding ALEC also means that they're funding climate change denial and union busting and stand your ground laws and laws to teach the denial of climate change in schools. So I think that's something where if AT&T recognizes that this is not going to blow over, that eventually they may drop their ALEC membership, and same with other corporations. I think ALEC has really been a valuable resource for them to push this agenda, but it's really up to the public to make it clear that we're not going to stand for our cell phone bills, the dollars we spend on our cell phone bill, to go towards funding these really reactionary laws. As far as pushing back on the legislation, I think the biggest piece is just going to be exposure, getting the idea out there that ALEC exists, that it's this avenue for these out-of-state right-wing interests to influence your elected officials to advance this reactionary law and policy through your state, that these laws are not being drafted for the good of the people of your state, they're being drafted for the benefit of some sort of ideological or corporate special interest.
And Edwin, I just wanted to dive a little deeper into the data and see if you could, from your experience, give any advice or examples of the ways that advocates might pull some of these numbers out and use them in their work in the field and as public interest advocates in state houses.
Sure, and Brendan is correct. So this is about public education, and first, people just need to know who the players are, and if it's ALEC and AT&T, and they're putting together legislation and it's coming to your state, then you need to just highlight that, bring it up. Then you can go to our website and you can say, okay, here's AT&T is given to this, all these people, all these lawmakers, both, and you can really look into North Carolina and find all the lawmakers and say, okay, AT&T is given to, say, 70 of 100 lawmakers. Well, those kinds of numbers get people's attention. And again, the money that's involved is not huge. So it's best just to emphasize that they are, here's a, New York City, international telecom that is coming into our state and is trying to control us. So getting the chambers on, the NFIBs, getting the small companies, and emphasizing that local nature, the local business, the local economic development versus the behemoth. And those are pretty easy pictures to draw for the public in a series of stories. But it is when we've seen the data be effective, and the data is just an exclamation point on the bigger captured system, but it's an exclamation point that people understand. So if you sit down and they're doing a press conference about how great this is going to be for the state, if you have an opposing press conference that says, yeah, but these guys got money from them, and by the way, here are all these other small companies that keep their money in our state. Let's be local about this. It's about trying to define the two parameters and if you can give lawmakers an opportunity to do the right thing, to stay local, it's and just put the lists out there. There are some advocates in different issues have done nothing more than print the list of lawmakers who got donations from a big company and gone through and circulated that through the halls of the legislature. That's an incredibly effective tool. And it's just the data. It's just the truth. They can't deny that. But what it is an indication of a company that is capturing a system and capturing the process and blocking out the little guy.
Thanks. Let's go to some questions. I think we have someone over here. And if you have another question, come down to either of the mics, and we'll try our best to answer.
Thanks. Earl Comstock, and just an interested observer here. But I guess my observation on all this, I think if you stop and look back, this relationship between businesses and politicians has gone on for as long as we can all remember. Certainly anybody that's studied history knows that it's been around. The difference is today you have a lot more knowledge about who is giving to whom. And, as a registered lobbyist, and a Republican, I'll observe that a lot of the dialogue here sort of implies two things. One, Republicans are bad, and two, lobbyists are bad. As somebody who is nowhere near as well-known and powerful as Bill Gates, I can tell you with great certainty if Bill Gates walks in and asks for a meeting, he's going to get a better reception than Earl Comstock walking in and asking for a meeting. So when you really think about the ridiculousness of some of this, it's apparent. But what it does point out is exactly what the gentleman at the end, Edwin, was saying, which is armed with data, citizens are much better informed about who is working for whom and who is contributing to what. I guess what I would say after working on telecom policy now for the better part of the quarter century is it's not really a Democrat or Republican issue. It's about communities. And I think one of the problems that I've observed consistently on this side is the other side is much more organized. It's a small number of players, namely the incumbents, and they have little problem getting together and organizing their thoughts. So to be more effective, and I would just toss this out for everybody's consideration, start thinking about, I think as Georgia did, who benefits from this and how do you educate the communities? And I would strongly urge you not to make it this is a progressive issue versus a Republican issue or conservatives versus so-and-so. This is about getting broadband to your communities, which is an essential service. And so I would hope that as you go forward with these campaigns, you focus less on the sort of political overtones, because I think you then lose a good part of your audience, and focus more on asking the question that needs to be asked of this community, which is, why is it that we can't, as if you've been following this blog along here, why is it that you can't get model legislation? And I'll tell you the answer is because there doesn't seem to be any agreement on our side as to what's needed. And so I think that's a place that I would urge everybody to start, and it sounds like at the local level there is some of that agreement, at least on one thing, which is that they'd like to see more broadband. So thanks for the comment.
Right. I mean, I agree. I think but I disagree. One minor aspect. You said it's not really a Republican or a Democratic problem. I would say it is both a Republican and a Democratic problem because they do both take money equally.
I would agree wholeheartedly with that.
And just to illustrate that, on the federal level, I looked at the FCC chairs and commissioners who've served since 1980. There are 25 of them. And 20 of those 25 went on to work for companies or to be legal counsel for companies or to consult for companies that they were put in office to regulate. That's 80%. It crossed the aisle. And the revolving door, we've talked a lot about the state level problems, but at the revolving door at the federal level, in particular at the FCC, is another problem that we need to be aware of.
I'd like to respond to your comments because you're completely on point. And I think that's why I was trying to talk about really thinking through what your message is. We did have we needed at least 4 votes. Well, the governor was going to veto the bill, but she didn't have the Democratic votes in order to support her veto. So we didn't have the votes we needed. So the Democrats in North Carolina actually were a problem. But the bigger point I was trying to make is yours, which is it's basically about the fact that people need access to broadband and not just 1 meg. We need real broadband that the rest of the world is getting. And now the business community is starting to understand that. It took 4 years. We didn't get that point. We're seeing it happen now thanks to Blair Levin and the Gig U project. And the other side of that is that you walk into a legislator's office with somebody in North Carolina like Sass, and Time Warner starts looking kind of small because there's this other really major corporation here who has one of the richest men in North Carolina as its leader. And the legislator realizes that the money might, if they lose Time Warner's money, there's going to be other money there too if they're looking for campaign dollars. So you're absolutely right. It is not about what party, it is not a party issue. It is about the message itself and expanding it. We also have the hospitals that are jumping on this now because they get it. Their doctors want the fiber to the home. So it is not about what party you're from.
Do we have any more questions?
Yeah, I have a
Thanks, Dave.
couple, and I want to take moderator's prerogative to ask the audience, how many people think that the Republicans led the fight to pass, the most recent fight to pass SEATOA? Okay, well, how many people think the Democrats did? Well, it looks like it's a tie, but in fact, I think the Democrats were the prime movers in advancing SEATOA and PIPA in Congress. So it is actually both parties' problems. So let me just emphasize that. Now my question is, and please forgive me for wearing my host's hat for a minute, but the question is, Georgia is now the 20th, potentially the 20th state to pass anti-community broadband legislation. A, what are the prospects in Georgia for it actually passing? B, what can we do to help stop this bad legislation from happening? And C, what are the other states that are queued up after Georgia, and how can we get involved with maybe some earlier interventions?
Well, I can tell you I can't predict the future, but Jim Baller is in the room, and there are enormous things going on right now to have businesses contact the legislators and make this an issue, get out in the open that this is as much a damage to the private sector as it is to the public sector. And Jim has organized an amazing coalition, including Google, Alcatel-Lucent, TIA, Gigabit Squared. They wrote letters to the leadership of Georgia's legislature and to the committee members. So I would say the more, as far as you guys, the more the issue is talked about across the country matters. Because I know in North Carolina, the bill's sponsor, she started stepping up in the committee hearings and saying, well, obviously everybody knows what my name is, which she didn't like. We kept attributing the bill to her personally so that she got the credit for what she was doing, which really helped. But that was ripping through all the national media and the blogs. So the more attention you guys can focus on Georgia, tell everybody how horrible it is. Will it pass? I don't know. I'm surprised it got this far. We thought it was dead last week, so that's not a good sign.
What's her name?
The bill's sponsor in Georgia or North Carolina?
Who's the bill's sponsor in Georgia?
There's a couple sponsors, and Jim, if you know them offhand, I don't have them on the top of my head. Is he here? No?
Okay, let's find them.
Yeah,
and
we'll
shame
put the
them.
names out and give them
Sounds-
credit for it. That's what you guys can do, and I really, really hope that you can help get the message out on why that's a really bad bill. Did I answer all your ABCs?
No, what are the states that are coming up that after Georgia that we think might present problems in the near future?
I haven't heard of any others. Joanne, you're in the audience. Have you heard of any other pieces of legislation that are coming forward? Anti-muni broadband legislation anywhere else? In Florida. Okay.
So, and it's worth pointing out that at the federal level, there have been legislative efforts to address this as well. There was a piece of legislation that was introduced in earlier Congress that had the support of Senator McCain. I believe Senator Lautenberg was behind it, that would have preempted some of the state level legislation. There's talk of a similar bill being introduced in the new Senate, and if you hear anything about that, Free Press will certainly be someone who can tell you that we would encourage you to call your senator and urge their support for that legislation. We have a question here, and then, did you want to come to the mic?
Tim?
Yes.
So I just clicked on that national map. I just clicked on Georgia. That gives you a list, because I had filtered for a telecom. That gives you all the telecom donors in Georgia for the last election cycle. And then I summarized it. So those are the people who are playing. If you click on anyone, we could do a reverse and show you the list of lawmakers who had gotten their data. So, you know, with a click of a button, when you're saying, who do we talk to? How do we approach this? Well, you know, through this list right here, who the players are, who the recipients of these donations are, and then you can start holding them accountable for how they're voting.
Great. Jim.
Dave, I'm Jim Baller. David, let me answer your questions. First of all, if you have interests of any kind at all in Georgia, especially business interests, there's still time for you to act. This week we expect the bill in Georgia to go to the floor of the House of Representatives. If it passes there, it'll cross over to the Senate, and then hearings will be scheduled in the Senate, and there'll be more time to respond, not much time. So if you have meaningful interest in Georgia, if you're part of an organization that has members in Georgia, please talk to me and I'll put you in touch with the folks in Georgia who are on the floor of the legislature who are coordinating the responses. And I agree with everything Catharine has said here. We get that it's all about business and about opportunity. That's our dialogue. Those are our big points. The industry has all the same big points that, as Chris pointed out earlier, have been in use since the beginning of last century in the electric power field. And our points are economic development, educational opportunity, economic development, and economic development. As to the future, the state legislatures generally meet in not the whole year, but they begin in about January, and their sessions typically run until May or June. And the bills that are going to be considered typically are introduced very early in the sessions by the incumbents who have been working the legislatures all winter long. And there's currently a bill in Utah which Utopia claims that it won't be affected by. And there's a positive bill in New Hampshire on funding mechanisms. Other than that, we have not heard of any other legislation in the works currently, so there's not likely to be. But next year, they'll be back, and we need to work throughout the year building leave-behinds, talking about those 20 states where we ought to be talking about how to roll back some of that legislation and not just be concerned about new bills that are coming up. And if you want to be part of that, our arms are open and welcoming for you to do that.
Join Jim's listserv. It's the most thorough resource of information on this. If you're not on it already, we'll start over here. Then we'll go over to Chris, then back to Dan, and over to Harold. And hopefully that'll get us to the hour.
Hi, my name's Daniel. Representative Jim McGovern introduced a couple of pieces of something, HR 20 and 21 in January, to do some things to remove the corrosive impact of money in politics. He did a Reddit session, Ask Me Anything, after he did his floor speech that got over 100,000 YouTube hits, he said. And somebody said, are you willing to be the example and swear off PAC contributions. He seems to be in a good place to do that. He's run, I think, 4 out of his last 6 elections unchallenged, and yet he's still running $1 million campaigns. He says that the Democrats require him to fundraise and help a lot of other people make money. But he was asked, somebody said, why don't you be the example? And he said he was not willing to unilaterally disarm. So I wonder, why do you think that he's framing this as a war? I mean, why does he think in his head that running a campaign where he was actually knocking on doors, meeting all his constituents and getting to know them so that when they went to the voting booths, they were ready to elect him because they knew who he was and they had met him and he hadn't wasted all of his time dialing for dollars and so on. Why is he thinking of this as a war where he would have to unilaterally disarm? Would like people to find me, I would like to do a petition to him and maybe the 18 co-sponsors of his legislation, which has gotten a 1% chance of passage on GovTrack, so that instead of just having another piece of legislation that we can all look at in a million years that didn't go anywhere, that something good comes out of this aside from a floor speech. Thank you.
Thanks. Chris?
Sure. One of the things I wanted to bring up was that every year we do see some good bills. It's very easy for them to crush these bills in committee. By them, I mean AT&T, Comcast, and others. So that's an area where we also have to build up a better movement. And to give you an idea, right now, New Hampshire is considering a bill that would make it easier for communities to build networks. Tennessee should have a bill that would reduce some barriers. It gets killed every year. Washington usually has a bill to remove existing barriers, and I could imagine one in Colorado. So I would encourage people to, contact me, muninetworks.org. We have a page, Decide Locally, where we try to, decidelocally.com, where we try to keep track of these things. But we also need to push some positive stuff, and it's a good way to build some coalitions.
Thanks, Chris.
Chris, we actually, in North Carolina, we also had a bill that we submitted in contrast to Time Warner's bill, and they did that. They just took it, they tabled it, they put it in the Rules Committee and tabled it, and that was in the Senate. And then the House, they folded it into their legislation, so it actually made things worse. So my answer would also be we have got to try to get something at the federal level. Even in this last round in Georgia, we saw FCC Chairman Jankowski, come out with a statement of that legislation that prohibited municipalities was bad law, bad legislation, and we need more of that. Well, I really feel like we really need federal legislation somehow.
So that there are solutions at the state and federal level that need support. Harold?
Yeah, I do think that you're right about federal legislation, even though I'm not sure anything is going to pass in this Congress. This Congress has difficulty passing a resolution to take a bathroom break. But it's important to have multiple fronts, which is just, I want to emphasize what Jim said and add one additional thing, which is one, I do think we don't need to wait. If you're running a network in a state, take the opportunity to introduce your state legislators, not just your personal representative, but go and do the tour. Look at how and some of us can at least advise in a general way of every way the incumbents cultivate these contacts, so that when something is brought to the floor, the vast majority of legislators don't suddenly discover this issue for the first time and just sort of generally ride along with the tide. One thing, though, I would put together as a question is we've also been seeing a lot of ALEC deregulation bills on the IP-enabled services and telecom generally, and I wonder if you've thought about the strategy of making common cause with the consumer groups who have been very focused on the fighting the deregulation fight, which is coming from the same source, and trying to create some common platforms of deregulation and increased, keeping local autonomy and enhancing competition.
Just 2 points here. As you're looking at being active at the local level and creating these networks that are responding with legislation, remember, to answer this gentleman's question, the power to offset the big money is the small money. Small donors in this country are extremely powerful. Our last election cycle just showed that. In Montana, 2/3 of the candidates who raised the most in small donations won. So getting on the ground, talking to people is a way of overcoming the big money. If you're organizing a campaign with people in your states, in your cities, communities around a local preference for broadband access, make sure they know who is going to be supporting your legislation, who you've talked to, and let them make a $20 donation. That is very powerful. So the solution as you're moving your issues is to connect with people, have that debate, and then ask them to engage at a different level, because it is power to the people. It works if you just let them know it does.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, my name is Ron Corvo. I'm here with an organization, Q Systems. We actually sell software for managing and building out and managing service providers on community networks. Software was developed in Sweden, where we have hundreds of community fiber networks, where in our hometown, where we're based from, you can get a gigabit connection in Umeå, Sweden for $28 a month, okay? And now, one of the things that they've done in Sweden that is not happening here yet, which I'd just like to kind of throw out there, is they've put together an organization called the Urban Network Foundation, or Foundry. And what this is, it's a collection spot, it's a single voice that all of these community organizations can go to. Think of it as cable labs for community networks, where they agree this is what a solution looks like. Here's where service providers can go to find networks that are looking for services. Here's where we can have a common set of agreements between service providers and networks. And even though we have a lot of stuff that's happening, it's not scaling here in the US. There's no reuse. There's no collection of this stuff and say, how do we work together so that we have a voice with all of these community networks? And this is something that I've been now investing my time and money in for almost 3 years, really understanding the market. And I think until we can really build such a organization that publicizes, yes, there is a industry here, and there is an industry that serves a very defined community. And as a resident on an island who has crappy internet, and our community's trying to solve it right now, I can tell you that the lack of that resource. Now, we go to muninet.org, I follow everything in this industry. And even with my background, there's no easy way to get your hands on all of that stuff and put something in the hands of a legislator or of a municipal organization that says, here's what you got to do.
Okay, what was the name of your organization again?
Q Systems, and we can help you.
Okay, we have very little time left, David, is that right? And I see two people who want to ask questions. I would just ask that you be quick about it.
Short question. At the state legislative level, how many persistent constituents does it take to actually move a legislator's position? I'm just a guess.
One with really deep pockets. You mean how many people like us? Or
How many constituents who are known constituents who are persistent on an issue? I mean, is 100, 200? How many makes a difference?
Well, I mean, I think recently we've gone through this whole thing with the NRA, right? And you've seen a few hundred people show up at state capitals or something. So, I mean, that's an extremely powerful group that is able to, bring some people up. And of course,
I'm speaking in a district. In other words, I'm a legislator.
Right.
In my district, some people get.
We
bumped.
really are out of time. So
Thank
if
you,
we
David.
could get a quick answer
you
and
have a handful of
wrap the
donors on
panel
each,
up.
say 10 or 20.
And you can't underestimate the power of gerrymandering too, and how that's squeezed certain constituents with certain views into a particular district. So it does get harder.
We'll make that our final question and answer. Thanks to the panelists for joining us.
Thanks to the panel.
This conversation will be continued in April at the National Conference for Media Reform. Free Press is putting on the conference in Denver, April 5th through 7th. I encourage all of you to come.